Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Bayou Time. I'm Martin Folse, and joining me today for a special program and to try to educate our viewing audience is Keith Weisheit. Of course, you know Keith here from Bayou Time, but he is a licensed social worker here in the area. He lends so much to the program when it comes to things we need to talk about of substance that go very deep. And today we're going to talk about suicide. We don't talk enough about it. We hear a lot about it, but when it hits home, it sends shockwaves all across our being. Keith, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Mark.
Appreciate you being here.
I appreciate it. Thanks.
And I'm sure everyone, every family, every person who's watching tonight can't escape that phone call they get, or that going in a grocery store, somebody saying, "Did you hear about?" And when you hear those words, it just, God, you know something that's coming up that you're about to hear is not good. But I want to talk about it. I want to bring it up because I can go back to my senior year. We had one of our classmates hung themselves our senior year, and it's something you never forget, but that you try to cope with and you try to understand a little better. So I'm going to give you the floor to sort of set the stage, because suicide is real. And we often say, "I didn't know." And a lot of times, maybe there are no signs.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so the interesting thing, I think a good starting point is to figure out that very often people spend a lot more time talking about a suicide after it happens rather than talking and thinking about the awareness before it happens. That's what we're going to do today. Talk about some of those things. One of the things that's very difficult to do statistically is to figure out maybe what people were thinking or why they were thinking it. So we kind of have to break down people who have attempted suicide, and we get some information and data from them about what happens. But those people that complete suicide, we don't always know exactly what's happening. But you're exactly right. The family, very often in that shock and denial about, man, how did this happen, or how did I miss it? And there are some warning signs. There are some risk factors there. And we'll talk about those. But recently, we've had, just last week, we had a teenager, an adolescent that committed suicide. Here this weekend, we had somebody our age commit suicide. And when it happens, I think all of us go, well, how did I miss it? Did I miss something? Were there some signs? Sometimes there's some external signs. Some of the ones we see for older people, a lot of times they'll do a couple of different things. They'll start talking about things, wanting things to be over. They say things like, "Oh, I wish it would all be over. I wish it would end." Or they do something like starting to give away some of their items, some of the things that they care a great deal about. Or the last thing is they may stop eating, or they may stop taking their medicine, some of those things. Those are a little bit more telling, but typically we don't see a lot of that or know a lot of that.
Let me ask you this, because I go back to my senior year, and I'm sure every one of my classmates watching this show, it's like it's yesterday. But as you go on and you see more of your friends or more of your acquaintances commit suicide, you start asking yourself just tough questions internally, like, did they know? How long do they normally know? Because sometimes you hear that they've reconciled this already plenty times over.
Yeah, very often when we look and see, and again, we get this information statistically from people maybe who have thought about it or who have attempted. And so some of those are planned. Some of those are very well planned. And there are a lot of people, like you said, that have this resolve. They have a sense of peace about themselves when they decide, this is what I'm going to do. For others, it's a little more impulsive. We don't see that they had that plan. And so for someone who, like your classmate, that's a little bit more calculated. Somebody who's thought about it, or somebody who makes a phone call to somebody else and gives them that clue, or the note or the letter that they write. So a lot of times there are those things that give us a little bit of an idea, but they don't really have very clear statistics about how many of those people have thought about it or not. But a lot of people consider suicide. It is very normal because, quite frankly, it's a type of coping mechanism. All of us have to cope with stressors. I think a lot of people think about that. Question is, do those people make a plan? Do those people act on that plan, or have they done that before?
And I think most people would get to the point where they say, no, I got more to live for, this and that. It's just, where is that threshold that somebody actually carries it out? To me, it's just got at such an extreme threshold.
Yeah, and so there's some risk factors about that, and so it's interesting you mentioned that. There's a show. It's a show about the holidays called The Holiday, and this one girl who's got a terrible relationship for 3 years, and she goes to her house and she's crying, and she turns the oven on, and she kind of looks at the oven, and then she kind of puts her head close to it, and she takes a breath, and she breathes in the gas, and then she stops and she opens the window and she puts her head out and says, "What am I doing?" I think that's what you're talking about.
Exactly.
That moment when we decide, no, I'm not going to do this. So what is that threshold? Well, very often there's a lot of factors. So when we come back, maybe we can talk about some of those factors that really kind of lead to that, because some of them are pretty interesting. I think our viewers
And I
would
want to
find
sort
that.
of pick your brain about guilt, because I remember at Vanderbilt, after our classmate committed suicide, there was a lot of guilt. And some people had no guilt because they did the right thing. Others who teased and did different things had plenty more guilt. I was telling a young group one day, I witnessed, we had a party going on, and there was this young isolated kid, not part of the group, sort of an outcast.
Right?
So I pulled a group of them together, the ones that controlled the whole class. And I said, "What's the story over there?" And they said, "Well, he's sort of different, and he's doesn't do much." And I implored him that day, get that kid and make him part of your group. Make him feel like he's the most special thing around. Bring him with you when you go eat. Do different things. And you're going to find out that difference is not that much different.
That's right.
So I think they did it. We go back to my senior year, when the person 2 days before he committed suicide, I had a long talk with him, and I thought I had reached him. But obviously the pain was so deep, and the teasing that was so deep, he couldn't get it back on track.
Right.
So the message to young children today, don't be part of the teasers, don't be part of the bullying. And I know you have some thoughts on that.
Well, you know, it's interesting. There's never one reason that people commit suicide. There's normally a number of factors that play into that. The National Institute on Mental Health is very widely known as the experts in that field, and I'll quote some of the things that they say. So some of the risk factors from a health standpoint are depression, which we know about. Depression is one of the leading factors for people that have a diagnosis, but substance use problems. People that use substances very often, their thinking is different, like somebody who may be an untreated mental health patient or a depression patient who's not taking their medicines. But substance use problems very often lead to a lot of financial issues, and they lead to a lot of disturbed thinking. And that disturbed thinking very often makes them think that that's an okay thing to do. Bipolar depression is another one of those things. People that have that manic depressive disorder, schizophrenia, personality traits, conduct disorder, serious physical health condition, including pain. And one of the interesting ones is traumatic brain injury, which can lead to so many different things. But those are some of the health reasons. Much like you talked about some of the environmental reasons, access to lethal means, including firearms and drugs. People that are always around firearms and drugs, it normalizes that behavior. Prolonged stress, such as harassment, bullying, relationship problems, or unemployment. Case in point, what you just said. And you tried to make a difference. I'll do the others real quickly. Stressful life events like life rejection, divorce, financial crisis, other life transition or losses, and exposure to another person's suicide, or to graphic or sensationalized accounts of suicide.
Let me ask you this, because I remember so clearly my senior year, and that's why I can talk about it, is that when we found out about the suicide, that the next few days at school were just, you could have heard a pin drop.
Quiet, respectful.
So many people had so much guilt because they had put that person through the ringer, never knowing that they pushed it
Right.
a little too far.
That-
And I want to talk about guilt, because you mentioned some things about guilt in the break. What is guilt?
Well, it's interesting. One of the things that was the most telling for me in graduate school when I went through SUNO, my teacher said that guilt is a thought, not a feeling. And I thought that can't be right. People feel guilt all the time. I asked him to explain. Dr. Gunther, God rest his soul, said that guilt is actually a thought that creates lots of feelings, very often sadness or anger. But we actually have more control over our thoughts than our feelings. Because of that, we can really do something. We can make a difference, like learning today, learning from this show that you're doing. We'll be able to help people think through the impact of the things that we say and do. And that way we won't have to feel that guilt or feel the sadness that comes from those guilty thoughts. Because that's what happens. We have these thoughts of, oh my gosh, did I do this? Was I the cause of this? What role did I play? And that's where I think people feel those sense of that, where that sense of loss becomes thoughts of guilt. And or sometimes a very natural feeling, should I have seen this coming? So sometimes we feel a little guilty about that, about, survivor's remorse, if you will, that
But
we didn't see it coming.
a lot of people don't see it coming because the person who's committed suicide was not in the frame of mind to let them have any kind of signs that they were contemplating. They were pretty coy about covering it up.
That is correct. And that's one of those things where we don't know that those percentages are real accurate because there are some people that they try to deal with things on their own. They don't ask for help. They don't reach out. Kind of like the kid in the corner, right? The one that you identified. What is the story? And it's a really important point because I think very often it's hard to tell what somebody's going through. Even somebody who seems really happy, somebody who's had a really wonderful holiday maybe, and then just kind of right after that, this happens. There's always more to the story. We don't always know about it or hear about it. They don't always tell us.
When we come back, I brought people in, I don't mind saying it. I point blank asked them, are you thinking about suicide? And I know my friends have done the same thing. It's a mindset. No one's comfortable with the conversation.
Right.
But sometimes you have to ask it. In production, we call it post-production blues. When you're hitting something hard, you're making a movie, you're doing this, you're doing that, and you're running, and all of a sudden it's over. Blues set in.
They
But
do?
it's normal.
Yes. Yeah, it's really interesting. We've talked about this very often, postpartum depression. I was fortunate enough to be able to spend some time researching that for our local social workers. And in one of those, it's very real. It's a chemical change. So chemical changes, once you have the baby, part of it's emotional and physical as well. You're caring for this infant for so long. You have the baby, and now there's that disconnect. And postpartum depression, very real. It used to be called postpartum blues. But now it's considered depression. Post-production blues, very real. I've done theater enough and done these kinds of shows. When the light's on, you got to be on. And when it's off and everything's done, you kind of look around like, where is everybody, right? It's very similar to holiday blues. Holiday blues is normal for this time of year, but when it goes into depression, that's when we need some help. So the question becomes, when do people need help? Well, I love the story that I was told years ago, very similar to your story about the guy that you worked really hard to reach. There was a guy who, on a Friday afternoon, loaded all of his books, took everything out of his locker, brought it and got on the bus, and he got onto the bus, and he's riding home with everything from his locker. And he gets off the bus, he trips and falls, and his books go everywhere. And one of the guys that played on the football team helped him pick up his books. He's like, man, we didn't even have homework this weekend. What do you have all your books for? And the guy didn't say anything. And so he helps him pick up his books, and he says, well, where do you live? He said, well, I live right over here. He says, oh, that's on my way. So he helps him bring his books. And so as he's leaving, he kind of stops and turns around. And he tells me, hey, we're playing football tomorrow on Saturday in the lot. Come if you want to. The guy goes out there. They play football. They become fast friends. This kid that brought all his books home turns out to become the valedictorian of his class. At his valedictorian speech, he talks about how he was convinced and convicted that he was going home to kill himself that day.
Wow.
The reason he took his books is because he had been, life wasn't worth living. He was taking his books home. that one simple, random act of kindness changed his entire life. That's what today is about. How do we change somebody's life? You did everything you could. You employed your friends to welcome this guy in. You spent time talking with him. And sometimes, no matter what we do, we can't really stop someone who really, truly wants to commit suicide.
And that's why I get to the next point is you do what you can do, and fate sort of has a way of taking over the rest, but just do your best. I urge students who see that person who's different, connect. That don't mean you got to be best buds.
Nope.
But if you're going out for pizza and you got the gang and you see that person, say, Joe or Jane, jump in. Come on, come have pizza with us. And just try to bridge the gap a little bit.
Welcome them in. Make them feel of value. That's the thing. Validate. That's what happens when we welcome people in, especially the popular kids. You know, you and I were fortunate in school. We were part of the popular group. I look at some of the people that weren't, but I got to tell you, I think I was destined to be a social worker a long, long time ago. I spent a lot of time doing that very thing, kind of seeing people's pain. It's one of those things, as God would have it, that I could see people's pain and trying to do something about it. So I guess the question comes up, when do you do something, right? Well, the warning signs are sometimes some of the things that we need to look out for is that they may have a change in behavior or that they have some entirely new behaviors. Sometimes people are acting very differently. So when they're talking, what do they say? If people talk about killing themselves, that's an obvious one, right? That's when we want to have that conversation. If people talk about feeling hopeless, if they say they have no reason to live, they feel like they're a burden to others, they feel trapped, or if they have unbearable pain. I have a friend of mine, a friend of yours and I's, who was a physician and had multiple surgeries and couldn't practice anymore. It was the unbearable pain that led to his act of suicide.
Wow. Yeah. And once again, we're so busy with our everyday life that sometimes we just don't stop and look at a person hard enough and say, something ain't right.
Yeah, what's wrong with this picture right now? What am I seeing? And it's a gut feeling, right?
It is.
And
most
something
of
you
the
feel
time.
in your gut. We should trust those gut reactions. And it's time to ask that talk. And look, people only get hospitalized for one of three reasons psychiatrically. Either they have thoughts of harming themselves, they have thoughts of harming others, or they're gravely disabled is the term that's used, where they can't really function, or maybe all three.
You made a great point when we started this program. You said most people spend time talking after the event. And that's true. And that's not to place guilt on anybody, but that's why we need shows like this where we start talking about it
Before.
now. And not only around Christmas.
That's right. We need
Keep
to have
the
these
conversation going. And if somebody looks off, pull them in and say, you okay? Or you thinking about hurting yourself? And you may get an answer.
Yeah, and you may get one that'll surprise you. The great news is we have so many area resources to help people. I want to open the door that if you don't know what to do, call here. Call HTV. They'll reach out to me. We will always, always, always find resources. Well, the last thing that we want is to go and let some of those things go unnoticed. And those are the things that we were talking about. People were talking. There's some behavioral things, some mood issues, and we'll go over those as well.
All right, Keith, I appreciate that. I appreciate you joining us on this very important topic. And we're going to continue to be vigilant. We'll bring on guests like Keith, so knowledgeable and trying to help people. But once again, if you're one of those and you want to reach out, he's right. Give us a call at the station. We'll set you up with Keith, and he'll set you up with whoever accordingly can help whatever problem you have. We'll take a break. Keith, thank you so much for being here.
Appreciate it. Thank
All
you,
right.
Mark.
We'll be back with more on Bayou Time.